behind it. But thank you very much, Diana Buttu and Hannes Alpen, for joining us and for sharing this responsibility of exposing position, interests, and needs on this particular subject. Many people discuss it already in articles and papers and meetings and interviews and analysis. But our interest as PASSIA and FAS is definitely the question of Jerusalem and what lies ahead on this occasion and on this chapter. The big question raised as I asked Diana Buttu to prepare something, where we go from here? Is this endless occupation? Nobody can stop Israel, or we have to look for different directions? Where are we on this? So let me give the floor to Diana Buttu to start within 20 minutes to tell us her perception, her ideas, her analysis on the issue, and where we go from here. Then we'll go for discussion with Hannes, what his views from living with us here, understood exactly what this conflict means and what lies ahead concerning all parties concerned. Diana, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a delight to be with you. I had hoped to be with you in person, but this is as good as it gets. So I hope that everybody is keeping well despite the circumstances. Look, we're at a very momentous time right now in terms of where we are in the space of Palestinian history, because we are now this Thursday is going to mark 72 years since the establishment of the State of Israel, since the Nakba. And it will also mark the swearing in of this new Israeli government, once again headed by Benjamin Netanyahu. In effect, we're at the same place that we were at probably about a year ago, but this time there are two main differences. The first main difference is that this time around we have a government where he's being endorsed, if not supported, and by Benny Gantz, a person who was originally standing in opposition to Netanyahu. And the second main difference, just in terms of this government, is that this is a government that is supposed to be formed as an emergency government, lasting for only an emergency period and supposed to be focused on emergency topics, with those emergency topics primarily relating to the coronavirus pandemic. There is, however, one very important distinction with this government, and this is perhaps the most fundamental change from a year ago to today, which is that within the agreement that has been signed between Netanyahu and Gantz, this rotation agreement that they've come to, there will be legislation that's put forward on the Knesset floor about the issue of annexation. So rather than this focusing on the coronavirus pandemic as was initially viewed, one piece of legislation that has the ability that goes outside of that framework is the annexation bill. And the annexation bill is important because we see that there is really no true opposition inside Israel to annexation. The only opposition that we're seeing right now is coming from the two main other parties that are not part of the government. One being the Joint List, consisting of 15 members, and then two additional members who were from the Meretz Party, so bringing the total to 17 members of a possible 120-member Knesset. What that shows you is just how fundamental and how much annexation has become part of the Israeli dialogue. It's no longer a question of whether they're going to annex. It's a question of when they are going to annex. It's become so commonplace among many of the Israeli political parties that it is reaching a status in the same vein as a lot of the slogans that we've heard in the past. Now, we're not there regarding Jerusalem. We're not there exactly. You know, Jerusalem is what they would call the eternal undivided capital, and all political parties across the spectrum, with the exception of Meretz and of course the Joint List, believe this. We're getting to that same place when it comes to annexation. In fact, with Gantz boasting that the idea was initially his idea, it wasn't an idea that had been put forward by Netanyahu. It was originally his idea. So you see that even within this spectrum, that you have people like Gantz and Netanyahu vying and trying to show just how much they support annexation, who is the much more annexationist of the two, whose idea is it. Now, let's step back. This is they're vying over who is the bigger criminal, in effect, because we know that annexation is illegal. Now, that being said, I want to take us back a little bit in time and talk about how it is that we got to this, place, and then hopefully we can have a discussion about where we move forward. I think for a lot of people, it's important to keep in mind, so I think a lot of people do not keep in mind that annexation has in fact been going on for quite some time. The difference is that it was an annexation that was happening de facto and not, in fact, by law. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples. The first, when the Israelis began to build and establish settlements, the initial settlements that were established, yes, were done by, as they would call it, maverick religious elements. But since that time, since 1967, what we've seen is that settlements are not, in fact, the majority of settlements are not, in fact, built by these rogue elements, but are instead being planned by the Israeli government with actual ministries or bureaus within ministries that are in charge of doing this construction, doing the planning, and so on and so forth. Now, what this means is that these settlements themselves have already become an arm of Israel. For example, if you are somebody who banks at Bank Leumi or Bank Hapoalim or any of the major banks, there isn't a separate banking law that's in place in any of the settlements. It's the same banking law that is taking shape in the settlement of Ariel as in the city of Tel Aviv. If you are somebody who seeks to open a franchise, for example, Cafe, one of the franchises that operates in the Israeli settlements, again, it is using Israeli law that is being applied to the establishment of the Cafe franchise in Ariel, in the same way that a franchise is being opened up in the city of Afuli, which is to say that there have been, since the establishment of the settlements, an incorporation of these settlements inside Israel. That has long been the practice. The only thing that hasn't happened is in two areas. The first area is in the realm of planning, where still the settlements still need to go, rather than going through a civilian planning system, they have to go through the army planning system. And what that means is, for example, I live in the city of Haifa. If the city of Haifa wants to add some new housing units within its cities, bill gets passed within the municipality. There's a debate usually about the environmental effects and so on and so forth. And eventually a decision is taken. That isn't the case when it comes to the settlements. There still is a requirement that they go to the Israeli army planning committees. And that is precisely the part that the settlers want to get rid of, is that for a long time, for as long as the settlements have been around, which is since 1967, their attempt has been been to try to incorporate these settlements as much as possible inside of Israel. And it's in the area of planning that we still see that one blockage. In every other field, or virtually every other field, we see that this is very much the case. For example, if somebody commits a crime inside any of the settlements, then Israeli law applies there. Whereas if a Palestinian commits a crime, they're subject to a different system of laws. In other words, it's a form of apartheid. The second area, and this is the part that is probably of more concern to you, where we haven't seen the actual annexation, is in the idea of the two-state solution. What has happened is that by continuing this de facto annexation, but not actually going for de jure annexation, legal annexation, Israel has been able to maintain a fiction that it still supports the two-state solution, and that it still supports the idea of Palestinians being able to have some type of entity that they can call their own. Annexation effectively puts an end to that. And what it says to the international community is that they no longer care about continuing the facade of the peace process. They no longer care what the international community thinks. All that they care is what it is that the settlers on the ground are thinking and saying. And as I mentioned, they want to have it incorporated as much as possible into Israel. And of course, they care what the United States says. And this is why within that agreement that was signed between Netanyahu and Gantz, that one element of the plan for annexation is that there needs to be U.S. Acquiescence, U.S. Acceptance of the annexation plan. And as we saw very swiftly after this was announced, the U.S. came out very, very quickly and indicated that they are in favor of it, with the Ambassador Friedman either tweeting or making some remark about it virtually every day. Virtually every day.
Magdalena.
So where are we in terms of can the situation be stopped? And the answer there is yes, of course, but it's going to require a completely different change in policy on the part of the other two main actors. We know that the Israeli government, left to its own devices, is not going to do anything. We know they've already, as I mentioned, most of the various most of the various political parties are in support of it. But there are two other parties to this that can and should be playing a role. The first is the Palestinian Authority. And on this, this is where I have, unfortunately, the least amount of confidence. Already, we've seen that the president has come forward and indicated that he will, as he put it, tear up the Oslo Accords, but without really indicating what tearing up the Oslo Accords means. Does it mean that he no longer wants to support the two-state framework? Or does it mean that he no longer supports negotiations? Or does it mean that he will no longer be involved in those coordination efforts, whether it's security coordination or other forms of coordination that have been taking place since 1993? All of that is entirely unclear, but it doesn't need to be unclear. What we are going to see is that with this, with the fig leaf, as I put it, with annexation, the fig leaf of the idea of the two-state settlement is finally being removed. And this is why it becomes very imperative for the Palestinian Authority to lay out a very different plan, one that is going to focus on, this is my suggestion, one that focuses on an anti-apartheid struggle, because that's what we will face, apartheid, rather than a continuation of supporting a two-state solution achieved through negotiations framework, which is what I think it is that he has been talking about. And of course, the second major player are members of the international community themselves. Now, here, I'm sure you've heard this many, many times, so I'm not going to beat a dead horse, but for all of the years that we have been watching these negotiations play out, one thing has remained constant, and that is that the international community continues to support the idea of a two-state settlement, but has done nothing, virtually nothing, to actually bring about that two-state settlement. What do I mean by that? I'll give you an anecdote, and Dr. Mahdi, you will remember this because I believe you were there at the time. Back in the early days when negotiations were still underway and there was still some hope that there was going to be a positive outcome to these negotiations, there were two main settlement boosts that happened. And the one that I'm about to speak of was with the construction of Har Homa, just outside of Bethlehem. And at the time, I remember that Palestinian negotiators had gone to the US administration, had gone also to others, and complained about the new construction of Har Homa. And at the time, I remember the response. The response was, no, we can't do anything about Har Homa or all of these other settlements right now because we are in a framework of negotiations, and we have to continue to plow ahead and get on with these negotiations because the negotiations will eventually undo the settlements. And then a few short months thereafter, when the Second Intifada started, and again, we saw another surge in settlement activity. Again, the Palestinian negotiators once again complained to the international community, and the response this time was, you can't expect us to do anything now. Now there's an intifada. And of course, the goal is to get back to negotiations. So we were constantly in a situation where there was really no effort to actually try to stop any of the settlement construction or expansion. But more importantly than stopping settlement construction or expansion, there had never been any attempts to actually halt this integration that has happened between the settlements and between Israel. In fact, it is now so seamless that in the eyes of many Israelis, Ariel is very much as part of Israel as Tel Aviv is. And so this is where there can be a shift. There can be efforts to start yourselves imposing a different framework and imposing different rules and holding Israel accountable if annexation is to take place. And there are different methods. I know that it's been mired in, at least for the Europeans, in those states that are more favorable to Israel versus those states that are more in favor of international law. But that being said, if this is not a situation that cries out now for international action, I really don't know what is any longer. Because by allowing this annexation to take place, we're going to also, this paves the way for annexation in different countries around the world. Take, for example, Russia and Crimea. And so this is why it becomes so imperative now for people to begin to take some action to actually stop the annexation before it takes shape. But not only stop the annexation, but to begin to try to break that connection, break that line between the settlements and between Israel, so that they're no longer seamlessly integrated. Because the world talks about the settlements as though they're somehow very different from Israel. But yet all of the research, everything has shown us, and in my short description has shown you, that they are very much integrated with one another. So you cannot simply focus on one without focusing on the other. I'm going to stop right there because I'm cognizant that we're at 3:24 and you told me 20 minutes. So I will stop right there, and I'm happy to
Thank you
answer
very much. Thank you. Thank you indeed. Thank you very much. We very much appreciate it. Hannes, it's your platform and your message. Where do we go from here? Is it true that it is a sign or a message, endless occupation, permanent occupation, no matter what we call it, apartheid, two-state solution is dead, cantonization, no matter the verb or the wording we are going to use, are we facing what people used to say, it's endless occupation, it's permanent occupation, nobody can stop it and you have to live with it?
Thank you, Dr. Marti. Thank you, Diana, for your thoughts. I tend to agree with a lot what you said. Nonetheless, I made out some points where I might differ. So I suggest that I quickly run through my thoughts of the theme of today, how to stop annexation, and then I'll point out the points where we might differ. So obviously we don't know whether this is actually going to happen or not, but I think in order to understand how it could be stopped, we first need to understand what are actually the driving forces. And when I agree very much with what Diana has said, what is wildly called a creeping annexation, then we have to ask, and I think almost everyone who's following this situation closely is agreeing that this is actually a very true description. So we have to ask, why annexation now? What are the driving forces behind it? And I also very much agree with Diana that there is not a big opposition to annexation in Israel. However, I would like to clarify that I don't think that means vice versa, that the whole of Israeli public is strongly pushing for annexation. It's more like there is a very strong push from the settler movement, who has also become more and more powerful in the government. And then there is, I think, a huge part of the Israeli society who just doesn't seem to care too much and doesn't seem to see opposition to annexation as a big priority now. There is nonetheless some very important voices like the Commanders for Security of Israel. I mean, you cannot neglect former heads of the army, former heads of Shin Bet, Mossad, etc. Obviously, on the left, there's a lot of opposition. But yeah, so what are the driving forces? What has changed? And I would argue there's two things. There's the huge paradigm shift in the US. The Trump administration that has departed from all international parameters, that doesn't seem to care about international law, about former UN Security Council resolutions, etc. And then there is the specific situation of Netanyahu himself. So I read a piece by Anshel Pfeffer in Haaretz lately, who was arguing annexation is not going to happen. It's not in the interest of Netanyahu. Why would he bring back the Palestinian question back on the table, back into the international arena after he has been working so hard to mute this issue? But I mean, this argument assumes that Netanyahu is actually acting according to a rational, that he would act according to what he perceives would be good for Israel. And I would argue that Netanyahu is not in that position. With one leg in prison, he might not act according to that rationale, but rather to a very personal rationale. So we cannot necessarily count on that. And then obviously there's the US and there is Trump, and another very personal rationale behind that, because with Trump not performing very well, to say the least, in the COVID crisis, and facing the re-election challenge in November, he might rely heavily on the evangelical vote and therefore actually push for annexation, or in order to have something to show for. So I also see this as a real threat. Now, when we look at factors that are actually mentioned that could be potential spoilers to this and that could make the Israeli government reconsider, I made out a couple, and then it's up for discussion how relevant they would be, right? So there is actually a huge opposition from coming from within Jewish diaspora. J Street is very actively fighting annexation, J-Link, etc. And it's not only, let's say, progressive Jewish American Democrats, but it's sort of starting really to sweep over to even some conservative Jewish diaspora voices. And so this could be eventually a factor. Then there's this linkage, obviously, between J Street and the Jewish diaspora and some opposition in the US Democratic camp. And some are arguing if Biden was to come out with a strong opposition to annexation, maybe with his chances of becoming the next president, this could maybe halt the Israeli government from pursuing annexation, or at least make them think twice. Then obviously there's the peace deals with Jordan and with Egypt. And in that case, I would argue that maybe the one with Jordan is much more important in this regard than the one with Egypt. Then there's the other international players, such as the EU and other individual, maybe European countries, but also Russia and other international actors. And then obviously, as Diana, you have pointed out, there's the PA. And I think there's a strong correlation between, let's say, a potential deterrence and how sincere threats of sanctions, threats of dissolving the PA, threats of dissolving peace agreements, etc. are. I think the Israeli government is one of the best in calling bluffs, and is also used to, and Diana, you pointed at that, is used to, let's say, empty words. So the international community has been, and basically pushing the idea of a two-state solution, but holding back from recognizing the Palestinian state, for example. Here comes in actually a point where we differ. So you were lashing out at the international community that it actually has virtually done nothing for the two-state solution. I would disagree with that in the regard that the international community has been very much committed in actually building a Palestinian state. I mean, I just have the numbers for Germany. I think over a billion throughout the the last 25, 30 years of investments into the PA structure. And I think it was during the time of Salam Fayyad that the World Bank called the PAs ready for statehood. So a lot has been done, and I think even now lately during the COVID crisis, actually the PA proved that it is actually able to fulfill some essential government tasks and state tasks. So it's not that the international community has not helped the perspective of a two-state solution. I, however, agree that indeed we're at a turning point right now. I see it as a big comeback of a null-sum game. If we see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as in history, there was a big paradigm shift in the late 80s and early 90s as the PLO decided to give up its fight for the whole of the territory, for the whole of the historic Palestine, for the perspective of a two-state solution. And it recognized Israel. That was a major shift from a null-sum game that can only be one winner, one loser, to a potential win-win situation and a two-state solution, and everyone embraced that. And now, I mean, the death of the two-state solution has been mentioned so many times, but I completely agree that annexation would be the final nail in the coffin of the two-state solution, and we would be back in the null-sum game of winner takes it all. And for the time being, that winner would be Israel. The losers would be the Palestinians. The losers would be international law. And indeed, I think it's time for the international community to face this and face this seriously. I also agree with the assessment that Israel doesn't seem to care no longer about what the EU or other international players think of what it's doing. I believe this is not true for the other way around. I think actually many countries in Europe care a lot about what Israel is thinking about them. But to be honest, I really don't know what they're fearing, what love could be lost, right? I mean, the EU and some European countries are the strongest friends of Israel. And there's unconditional support for the security of Israel. There's unconditional support in so many ways, trade relations, etc., EU neighborhood policy. But the love was not really shared, right? What they have been getting for it is being called pro-Palestinian, which is not a bad thing in my opinion. I think we should get away from this notion that pro-Palestinian is a bad idea. Also pro-Israeli is not a bad idea. I think, every sane mind should be pro-Palestinian and pro-Israel at the same time. Anyway, but being called out pro-Palestinian or anti-Semites, etc. So I don't think European countries would have much love to lose in this regard. However, and this could be maybe my last point before we get into the discussion, the idea of sanctions. Now, obviously, this is a very sensible issue. And in the history of Israel, no one has really played hardball with Israel. And I'm now talking about let's say the Western international community. And my reading is that, let's say for the first 30 years of Israel, that was due to a real existential threat to Israel. So there was a lot of support for Israel. And obviously there was the Cold War. So Israel was a strong ally in that context for the West and within the Cold War. And after the ending of the Cold War, there was the two-state solution. So there was also never really a true reason to play hardball with Israel. And this is something the international community would need to learn. And I'm also not sure where it would lead to, right? You know, when you play hardball, you know, people can be stubborn. I don't know whether it's going to help much in this context of conflict. But definitely, from my opinion, there could be a solution rather than trying to punish someone for one's behavior. It would be actually due time to act according to one's own values. So if you share the idea that a two-state solution is the only viable solution for everyone between the Jordan and the Mediterranean to live in peace together, then you would have to do everything to keep this option alive and not to have the null-sum game win over. And I think if you, you know, if you're such a strong proponent of the two-state solution, you should also not just recognize one of the states, but you should recognize the two states. And I just want to leave you with one thought that actually Ami Ayalon, the former head of the Shin Bet and head of the Israeli Navy, pointed out in some J Street talk the other day. He said, just imagine, he was asked whether the US should, you know, if there was a democratic presidential, a democratic president in the US, whether they should, you know, take back the move from the embassy to Jerusalem. And he said, just imagine a future. He said, no, they should leave the embassy in Jerusalem. He said, just imagine a future where there would be just a strong commitment from the US to a two-state solution. And rather than pulling out the one embassy, they would recognize the state of Palestine and they would build an embassy for the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And this wouldn't even include any sanctions or any conditioning of military aid to Israel. It would be just a very strong commitment to the idea that Palestinians and Israelis should live in two states side by side. Things that have been, you know, enshrined in UN resolutions and have been propagated by the international community all along. So it wouldn't be such a big step, and it wouldn't be a punishment of Israel for breaking, once again, international law, but it would be just a very strong commitment. And similar steps could be pursued by individual states in Europe or by the EU. So I'll leave it with that for now, and looking forward to this session.
Thank you very much indeed. In order to open the floor for discussion, I just want to put two questions, one for Diana and one for you, Hannes. For Diana, when you apply the idea that we are heading towards a de facto apartheid state in the making, are you inviting the Palestinians to reconsider not only the agenda for the two-state solution, but to consider all Palestinians in Israel and in the occupied territories, as well in the diaspora, to look for a new agenda facing this apartheid state, which means going back to the old thesis of one state, democratic state for all its inhabitants? Is this where we are heading? Is this a wake-up call for the Palestinians, a last wake-up call for the Palestinians to reconsider their agenda? And can they do that in spite of their division and interests and different loyalty? For Hannes, the idea of Europe and the international community has been invested millions and billions of dollars towards two-state solution. From the Israeli perspective, they will say, this is funding five-star hotel occupation. They are covering our interests. This is Judea and Samaria. This is to contain and to observe the Palestinians in a small basket here and there, but we will carry on business as usual. Judea and Samaria is ours. And annexation is a formality. We have been in full control for the last 52 years. Nothing would change, but we will keep on playing the game of political messages. Okay, let's talk about two-state solution, but in reality, this is paying the Palestinians authority to maintain and control its people under military means with Israel cooperation. Diana?
yes, I think that you're right. I think, look, I want to step back for just a second. We've had two Palestinian presidents in our history, and I hope this doesn't come off as sounding unkind, because it isn't intended to be unkind. So this is a caveat. I really don't intend this to be unkind, but I do want to show you the contrast between these two leaders in terms of their different approaches. We've had two Palestinian presidents, and one of them brought us back from the verge of national extinction to becoming people on the international stage. We could have ended up like other groups around the world, like the Kurds or the Armenians. And yet with Yasser Arafat, for all of the bad things that he had as well, again, this isn't to praise him, what he did was he brought us back from that national extinction and placed us on the map. And in placing us on the map, we suddenly had names and faces and a cause. We had the world that was looking at us and wanting to support us. And then we had our second Palestinian president. Now, our second president comes on the heels of the first and continues to take on the project that was, of course, adopted by the first, but takes it on with real earnest. And instead of us being on, bringing us back from the verge of national extinction and bringing us as players, we're now heading back to that same direction, where it's now instead the focus on statehood, on a small segment of Palestinian society, and no longer on us as a people as a whole. And the reason that I say this is because we are greater than that. And I think that history has shown that we are greater than that. And I don't think that we need to be boxed into a framework that has been on the table now for roughly 30 years, when instead we're people who are richer than that. Our cause is deeper than that. And our needs are deeper than that as well. And so this is why I'm hoping that this opportunity isn't just I'm hoping that this is an opportunity, let's just say that it isn't just a time where we look and we say, we're either going to tear up the Oslo Accords or pull some other stunt or do X, Y, and Z to get us back into that smaller framework. But I'm hoping this is an opportunity where we step back and really assess whether any new steps are going to bring us to national extinction or bring us back from national extinction. So I do believe that we should be looking at greater frameworks. We should be looking at an anti-apartheid struggle. We shouldn't be just separating out Palestinians who are citizens of Israel who suffer also from Zionism. We shouldn't be just separating out refugees who have also suffered from Zionism. And instead, we should be focused on something that is greater. And that something is greater is not a zero-sum game, but it's a way of recognizing that the root cause of why we are here is not because we don't have a state, but it's because of Zionism. So I do hope that we step back. I do hope that we start analyzing whether one state is the way that we want to go. I do hope that we start using an anti-apartheid framework. And I do hope that we start recognizing that we are greater than what has been portrayed for the past 25 years.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Hannes, 5-star hotel, Europe funding, maintaining, containing the Palestinian Israelis enjoying Judea and Samaria. It's irreversible occupation.
Look, Mahdi, I think the message that goes out from annexation is very, very dangerous, because it's there is two things that are happening at the same time, right? So Israel has been treating the PA in a way that it was holding back tax revenues, Palestinian tax revenues. It has continued the settlement project without stopping. Now we have the concrete threat of annexation. And it has been portraying the PA that has recognized Israel and is working closely with Israel on so many levels, the most important one on security, as no partner for peace. So this is the one development. On the other hand, we have a situation where Hamas, which doesn't recognize Israel, which hasn't let go of violence, is actually taking more seriously than the PA. There's no more settlements in Gaza. The Hamas is indirectly negotiating over prisoner exchange, over the exchange of goods, over a long-term truce, etc. So what's the message that comes out from the and I haven't mentioned the portraying of a non-violent struggle against the occupation as being anti-Semitic. So the messages that come from there are very, very dangerous, and which is also very disheartening is a correlation between actually whenever we see a spike in violence in the conflict, we see also a spike in agreement for a two-state solution. This is a very disheartening correlation for those who argue for a peaceful and dialogue-oriented solution of the problem. So very, very, very detrimental the way Israel was dealing with the PA lately. And I do agree a lot with the fact that the international community so far has supported the PA and was somehow a counterbalance to that narrative. However, I also agree that it puts the international community in a very hard spot once there is annexation and there is a real loss of the two-state solution. No one can deny that after annexation. Then supporting whatever is left of the PA, right? I mean, the PA is, at least Fatah is openly talking about dissolving the PA if this is gonna happen. And we don't know whether they're serious because they announced it many times. And there's a lot of self-interests involved, etc. But if it was gonna happen, maybe there would be some remains of civil administration because the Israelis don't really want to take care of all Palestinians. And whether it would be okay in that framework for the international community to keep, supporting in a way it did support the PA is a very hard question for the international community to answer, because indeed they will be seen as complicit of an ever ongoing occupation.
My dear friend, somebody like Dan Kitzer, former American ambassador to Israel and major negotiator in Oslo and after Oslo, was saying clearly, US State Department or US administration should prepare their homework after election vis-a-vis this annexation. Europe should work on sanction against Israel. Are we looking for this international impact on this? Can I hear Ammar Dweck response on this? Are we expecting an international role in this, whether US future election or whether Europe can have sanction on Israel? Ammar Dweck, are you with us? I don't know. Dawood Kuttab.
Actually, I have a feeling that this annexation issue is going to blow away. I think Europe and Jordan and other countries have made a strong position. And I'm a bit worried if it goes away, because I think it's like we put all our effort now in stopping the annexation and we forgot about the occupation. And I'm a bit worried that we are still not working on unity. We're still not working on a strategy, and we're still reacting, not proactive. So I don't know if my analysis is correct, but I have a feeling that this annexation issue has been created as a big thing. And now that Netanyahu got what he wants, he probably will, maybe he will delay it. But in the meantime, we're all worried about the annexation that we forgot about the occupation.
Anybody else would like to join? Yes, go ahead, Nadia.
Thank you actually for this very interesting interventions. But I would join Dawood's point in being caught with annexation and forgetting occupation. But it's again, it's part of the game, you know, it's part of the whole idea of occupation. So annexation is a vital part of occupation as well. But so there is this point of thinking of how things are going from politics, like, you know, big politics decisions, and where it's going on the ground with people who see today annexation as an opportunity. And I think this is very worrying from one side, and from another side, as a regular person who thinks of how this PA thing failed us as a people, might really be an opportunity. And this kind of opportunity is definitely not giving us better rights or better anything, but it puts us in our actual status of being people who live under occupation. This is the reality of the thing ever since the PA creation. I don't think it's like anything happened to us except practicing occupation in different terms. And this is the real thing that took us away from our real issue or cause as a people under occupation. And somehow I would like this, my other point is directly to Diana's, I would say, comparison, let's say, from the first president to the second. I have to say, maybe this is one of also the illusions we as Palestinians lived in, that we really, and I do understand why, but I think it's time that we really like face things for what they really are. How much really, like, you know, Arafat brought us closer into ending occupation. Actually, like, there is a whole, you know, now it's like it's a whole new notion of thinking of what really happened since Oslo, and we're worse many times in our rights as people, like people who really had this kind of like rightful struggle of against occupation. And today we're just like asking, and we're actually pointing to achievements that are, you know, like a maximum could be if we want to keep an account in a bank for a prisoner or not. Like, you know, it's like there's nothing actually to ask from the PA to Israel more than very, very technical, basic need issues at this point of this struggle. So I think it's like, even though I am, of course, I think like many, not a fan of Mahmoud Abbas's governance, but I think as well that Abbas is nothing but a natural consequence of what Arafat started. And this is where the problem is. And between us being good people, or I do believe in us as people, that is true. But then I go back also to the same paradox of thinking today. It's like these people that are governing us today are from the people that I'm proud of. So there is something wrong with the whole leadership concept of Palestinians that is driving us back all the time into this, I would say, bottleneck of suffocation, that we don't know where we're going after it. So I think it's like there is, as much as Israel is responsible on many things, the international community, the PA itself also, but we do not dare to face things for what they are. And this is where I think that we need to do this. We need to dare, as Palestinians, whoever, whatever, however we define ourselves, to start really looking into where the real problem is in us as people who produce such leadership and this such continuation of a misery. Thank you.
Diana?
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to respond to both of those, if I may. Look, I want to be clear about what I meant by the difference between the two. And I'm not somebody who glosses over Arafat's history at all. What I'm trying to say is that if you think back to 1948, and I think for us, our history, the 1948 is a very important time in history, when in the aftermath of 48, when you had people who were now stateless, dispossessed, refugees, scattered around the world, we had a leadership that managed to put us on an international stage that created a movement of us as people, where we were the ones who were talking about anti-imperialism, bringing down Zionism. It was a different focus. So yes, you are right that Arafat is the person who signed Oslo, and that was a huge not only stain on his history but blight as well. But what I think is important is that it could have been in 1948. We could have been just like every other group that had suffered during that period and fallen off of the world's radar, and instead we haven't. I don't buy into this idea, which by the way is very much, the Israelis always say this too, that there's something wrong with us, that we're producing bad leaders. There's nothing wrong with us that we're producing bad leaders. That's not the problem. The problem is not us. The problem is that we're confronting a system in ways that don't make sense. The solution to Zionism is not the creation of a Palestinian state. That's not the solution to dealing with Zionism and the expulsion of 75% of Palestine's population, the ongoing racism that we feel here inside this country as supposed citizens. I'm being one of them, of the state, or of the lockdown in Gaza and the blockade. This isn't because we're bad people or that we don't know how to choose leaders. It's because the goal that has been selected is one that's flawed, and the goal of constantly going after a state and focusing on this issue of statehood is one that I believe is fundamentally flawed. I also want to touch upon this issue that Dawood and Nadia both mentioned, which is that the annexation itself might be a fig leaf, and that this is just a way of Netanyahu gaining support. Now that he has it, he doesn't really need to proceed down this path. That very well may be the case, but that may be the case for this current period of time. But that's not the case when it comes to their long-term vision. And this long-term vision is one that has been put forward by the settlers since 1967. And all you have to do is just read, Plan Dalet was exactly that. And it's just been waiting for the right time. The settler movement is putting a lot of pressure on Netanyahu because they do view that the window is short to be able to pass annexation. And that window is from now until we see the end of President Trump, which might be in November. It might not be, depending on how the U.S. political system works. I think at least a few of us were probably a little surprised that Donald Trump got elected to begin with. That being said, so if annexation doesn't happen now and potentially is going to happen in the future, we shouldn't be waiting for it to be potentially happening in the future. We shouldn't be waiting for it to be, whether it's July or November or 2021 or 2023 or whatever. The planning has to begin now. And anything that we are working on has to focus on the here and the now. And this is why I, in my remarks, didn't mention the idea of one state. This was after at Mahdi's request. But I do think that we need to start focusing and shifting into an anti-apartheid struggle, because the occupation is apartheid, and beyond being apartheid, it's also gotten to the point where it is illegal. And so this is where I think we have to focus our energies, but instead our energy has been focused on is it two-state, is it one state, is it what's going to be the future of Oslo, what is the Palestinian Authority, and so on. And I also just want to add one final point. You know, the international community has done a lot for Palestine in terms of supporting the Palestinian Authority. And this I can't underestimate, and I don't want to underestimate, because the support because left to its own devices, Israel's not going to do anything for us. We know this from the days that before the Palestinian Authority existed. We know that Israel's not going to step in and do anything to support us. It was the opposite. They were taking the tax revenues and not using it to spend on us, just in the same way that they're stealing the tax revenues now, and now charging us interest for a loan on it. But that being said, with the international community and their support has been primarily financial, to make sure that we are able to still stand on our own feet. And in my conversations with many of you, the question that I think a lot of you debate or come up with or think about and have to grapple with more than I do is that money going to develop a Palestinian state, or has it gone to finance occupation? And if there eventually is a state, then maybe the world can say, yes, this is the money that was well invested to build a state. And if there isn't, then of course it's the latter of financing occupation. But isn't there a third alternative, which is to be able to support and fund an anti-apartheid struggle? And that, I think that we have to start looking at these different frameworks, at this different way of thinking, and not be strictly bound to whether it's going to be the Palestinian Authority and what that entails, but to actually be thinking about working on confronting Israel and confronting the occupation and holding Israel accountable, rather than just on whether we are able to stand up and have something called a Palestinian Authority that's financially able to support itself.
I think Ammar Dweik wrote about it in his article. Is there, the question to Ammar Dweik, is there a political will? Is there a consensus among Palestinians that we are entering a new chapter and we need a new agenda? Ammar?
Hi, Dr. Mahdi, everybody. Thank you for your distinguished speakers. Actually, I heard your question early on, but I had a problem with my mic, so sorry. But I was following up from the beginning. I believe you asked me first about possible sanctions on Israel by the EU and by the United States. And I find it ironic, because I think we are now under sanctions by both the EU and the Americans. And if you look at the scene here from inside Palestine, we feel that under enormous pressure from everywhere, and every component of our society now is under enormous pressure. The crisis of the Palestinian prisoners and banks that erupted last week, it's a very serious problem, and we perceive it as part of a global agenda to put pressure on Palestinians. or at least this is what Palestinians perceive the situation now, that everybody is putting pressure on us, on prisoners, on civil society, on the government, attacking our narrative, delegitimizing our cause, delegitimizing prisoners, delegitimizing civil society, delegitimizing our curricula. So we see it as part of a global assault on Palestinians in order to force them to accept deal of the century or whatever like deal that Palestinians would not accept in normal circumstances. This is what people here in Palestine perceive it, at least. Second, the annexation plan comes at a very critical time for Palestinians. We are in our weakest positions since Oslo. We have a serious problem of legitimacy for the PA and for Hamas in Gaza. Both of them lack electoral legitimacy. And based on that, we see many problems taking place on a daily basis, like people, attacks, for example, like demonstrations or some signs of lawlessness in the West Bank, inability to enforce laws. You see revival of tribal judiciary or tribalism in the West Bank. Signs of weakness and even disintegration of the PA that might lead to collapse or lawlessness in the near future. So things for me, and I believe it's very pessimistic, at least on the very short term. Internally, we are divided. I don't see any signs of the Palestinian leadership responding to public demands for elections. I don't see really genuine steps from Palestinian leadership to arrange our internal house to be able to face all these enormous challenges. On the contrary, we see even further fragmentation within the political system itself. Even within Fatah, we see fragmentation. So the picture looks very pessimistic, at least at the near future, maybe for this year. Will add to the corona and will add to many other disasters we are seeing. The annexation will be an additional disaster. However, I see for the shorter term, for the longer term, I see opportunities. I see an opportunity now that it's for Palestinians. It's time for us to align ourselves with all those who support human rights and international law. And it's obvious now that Israel is negating international law and is not, as you know, Hans mentioned, it's the two-state framework now is collapsing. So it's an opportunity now for us to really go back to square one, to talk about a human rights-based approach and international law-based approach to the struggle.
Thank you very much. Samer and Sebe?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Mahdi, and thank you everyone for your important input. You know, when Diana mentioned the Kurds and the Armenians and the national struggle, it occurred to me that they've actually obtained their own states. I mean, Armenia already has a state, and the Kurds are much better off today than they were during our struggle. My question is now, talking about the struggle, if we want to shift the paradigm to a one-state solution, I mean, do we just let go of all the achievements? Hello? Hello? Hello?
We hear you, continue. Okay.
We can hear you, we can hear you, go ahead.
My question is, over the last 30 years, there've been the struggle to achieve a two-state solution. We've achieved recognition on several important arenas. I mean, legally speaking, from an international point of view, is it feasible to just drop off all the achievements that has been achieved and start all over again with a one-state solution? What about the partition plans of 1948? What about 242? I'm not sure whether we're talking about something that is practical on the ground. I don't know what's the legal opinion on that.
Thank you. Hannes?
Yes, thank you. I would actually follow up on that. I mean, we're in a situation, if I'm counting correctly, where like 138 something states that recognize Palestine as a state. If we look at Europe, we have all these states from the former Soviet bloc who already recognized Palestine as a state in the late 80s. We have newcomers such as Sweden since 2014. We actually have in almost all the other states, we have the parliaments and all the big states, France, Italy, Spain, Great Britain, no longer a part of the EU, but still an important country in Europe. We have the parliaments demanding the recognition of the state of Palestine. So there are quite a lot of achievement towards statehood. Yes, the Palestinian state currently doesn't hold sovereignty over major parts of its territory and other sovereign rights. But it would actually be quite a paradigm shift to a one-state solution. And my question would be, it would essentially mean a shift from, a struggle between, let's say, Palestinians and Israelis towards a struggle between those people who think there is a peaceful solution between the Jordan and the Mediterranean for all people. And that would mean that also Palestinians would have to overcome this whole idea of anti-normalization, which would be a huge obstacle if all of a sudden the idea goes to a struggle within the whole territory for equal rights. Then in my eyes, it cannot go without, finding allies on all sides, and then this whole anti-normalization notion is basically should be over. So I actually do see there's a lot of benefits that have been achieved towards a two-state solution that would be given up, and there's also other obstacles that would have to be overcome. And I'm not talking about all the personal benefits that are tied to the current situation.
Thank you. My beloved cousin Saad Abdel Hadi, you think, my dear cousin, this one-state reality, you think the youth can have a different direction and different agenda in facing one-state reality without calling it apartheid or no apartheid?
Yes, I'll tell you something. Now, I'm happy you are saying the youth. You are asking me about the youth. I'm not so youth now. So, but okay. Thank you for this, for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. And I would like to raise a few points, which is I thought would be interesting to think of. Number one, I understand the position of Dawood and Nadia when they talked about that annexation is not a must soon. I think it will be. The annexation for the Gantz-Netanyahu program is coming. Mostly it will be coming in July, and I think it's the best opportunity for them to go for it. So we should think from our side and plan our position on that term. So mostly it's coming, and as we have seen what Pompeo, the foreign minister of the US, have asked the Palestinians to have an alternative plan. This means that they are going for that plan, and they want to put us in a position where we don't give an answer, which means that Palestinians lost this opportunity as usual. So this is the plan. About the one-state, two-state solution, unfortunately, I haven't heard Diana's speech from the beginning, but I agree with her that we should change our mindset. We shouldn't think much about one state or two states, because both solutions are not possible, at least for the short and medium term. We are talking about what we should think of is how do we talk about our narrative. The struggle is about the narrative. So either we have a small country or a small state in the West Bank, or we don't have, or in Gaza, or we have a one state or anything. The problem is, or the struggle is about the narrative, our narrative against their narrative, and their narrative against our narrative. So the struggle is on that area, and I think we should concentrate there. We should concentrate on having, because there is no solution with the Israelis unless they drop Zionism, they drop apartheid thinking and planning and working on. So we have to think on that area in order to reach to what we think is a solution for the struggle in not only in Palestine, in the Arab region even, because we have to think wider than Palestine. I think when we talk about our struggle and our future, there will be no future if we think about ourselves alone. They separated us. They have made us four types of Palestinians. We are West Bank, Gaza, 1948 areas, and the diaspora. So we have to think wider, and we have to think for a solution which covers the whole story, which talks about narrative against narrative. So that's how, at least, I think of the future and what's possible, what might be coming soon. And we have an opportunity there. We don't have an opportunity if we think about a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, or in Gaza alone, or a one-state solution. The opportunity is for having a real solution, which is a long-term solution, of course, not a short-term. Thank you.
Thank you. Final remarks from Diana and Hannes. Closing remarks.
I'm happy to take more questions if there are any, but if there aren't any.
Summing up, conclusion, summing up.
As a summation, I think that one way or another, sorry, let me step back. The Israeli government is not going to back down from this. The test balloon has been released, and with the test balloon being released, it's really just a question of time as to when it is that they're going to fulfill this annexation. That being said, I think that the obligation is now on us to both think of ways to not only push back against this annexation, but to be reconfiguring and pushing back against what Israel is doing as a whole. And that means us, not just as Palestinians, but also as members of the international community. By not doing so, I think the consequences are going to be grave, both for us here as Palestinians, but also for the international system. And I also think that we really, if I were to give one thing that I think that we have to start looking at as well, is because this annexation has been going on for quite some time, as Hannes put it, the creeping annexation has gone on for quite some time. We also have to think of how to even stop that annexation. If there is really a push to have a two-state settlement, the time is now to put into place actions to actually have that take shape and to end Israel's rule, rather than just simply gloss over it and pretend that it will all be magically undone one day.
Is there anybody from the international community, diplomatic missions, would like to contribute to this comment? Anybody from diplomatic missions? Yes.
Yes. Hello. Good morning. I'm Pierre from the EU. So thanks for this presentation. Just one word reacting on the on the comment that's been made on the focus on annexation that we are in right now. I do understand the logic, and we shouldn't forget about the everyday occupation, and we shouldn't forget about that. But I do see merits in the focus on annexation right now, because as you know, tomorrow, for example, on Friday, sorry, in Brussels, we'll have a Foreign Affairs Council with the Middle East peace process on the agenda. And this is the first time it happened in years. So that's quite interesting to see that annexation actually puts back on the agenda as a whole the Palestinian issue. And that is positive to my understanding. And it's not, as I would say, in conflict with the fact that we also want to address and tackle the occupation. So that's just my point. It's mostly positive, the focus that we're putting right now on annexation, because it puts the whole issue, the whole problems, the whole conflict back on the agenda.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Mahdi.
Yunan?
Yeah, thank you very much. I am really happy to hear this. And I want just to say two things. That my first point is the heads of churches in Jerusalem have clearly expressed their opposition to any kind of annexation because it's against the international law. But you know, my question would be to Hannes and to European Union. I don't think there will be any punitive measures if annexation take place. I think it's all lip service. But what I'm asking, you know, Hannes, for example, and the EU, will they take the Swedish model in recognizing the state of Palestine and daring to take and the Vatican? Or will they say it's not time and find only excuses? I believe if we are serious, then the EU must follow the Swedish model and the Vatican model and other countries, not only to wait until the UN will vote and to say we recognize Palestine on 1967 borders. I think that will be a positive step forward, and it will give Palestinians, you know, some kind of encouragement that there is a seriousness from the international community. My next point is about the PA. I think, you know, we need, Mahdi, I'm really appreciative. I don't see young people who are really coming as leaders, and that's a problem. And secondly, I don't see that now we have a strategy, and that's not good for us. And for this reason, now we are only concentrating on annexation, but I don't see a strategy which we can offer to the international community where they will back us. I think that is also another problem which we have to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you. Final remark from Hannes, please.
Okay. So obviously, the international community is put into a very tough spot through this development. And as I have pointed out, the international community is not used to playing hardball with Israel, and usually doesn't have an interest in it. Okay, there's very strong and close relations. And they feel very uncomfortable being in this situation, that basically Israel asks either full loyalty for, you know, itself as a country, but also for its occupation and annexation project, you know, sort of pushes the international community in a situation where it has to decide between its loyalty with Israel and or international law. So and since there was the idea of a two-state solution, there was still like null sum action, like the settlement buildings, etc. But it could always be seen as something that is like tactical moves of Israel to, you know, put themselves in a better negotiation position, etc. So, you know, everyone was somehow happy to find excuses for this. Even like on the Israeli left, this was a notion that they were thinking, eventually it will end up with a two-state solution. Once that is gone, the international community really has to come to terms with putting an emphasis on a two-state solution, or yeah, I don't know what they will end up with. What I know for sure is that we don't even know, even if some individual states or the EU come up with decisions, that this will serve as a deterrent to Israel, because no one really knows, you know, whether it is then meant as a deterrence or whether, you know, it is perceived as something that will actually then happen. There could be some miscommunication in this whole regard, right? That some people would say, yeah, if this happened, you know, then the EU says that this step will not remain unchallenged, you know, and then Israel will go through with annexation, and then, you know, even if, and I doubt that, but even if then there was sanctions, then the Israelis were going to say, what are you doing? I know you were saying that, but you were also saying lots of things in the past and you never acted on it. So why are you now all of a sudden serious about that? So even if there is now a sincere decision to play hardball, it doesn't mean that you know, that this will have a deterrence effect. One last thought, because I've seen this even in our debate today. I think this push for annexation and what I call the resurrection of the null-sum game. My biggest fear is that this is actually triggering like a dialectic reaction, right? That you know, you will now see, you know, Palestinians arguing, okay, now we have to go back, narrative against narrative, this against that. I think the only real answer is that both people will be here. And they will have to find a way that they can live in peace and in dignity somehow together or side by side. And that any narrative that is developed now should always include the other, without, you know, falling back into this idea that there can be only one winner.
Very much appreciated. Thank you very much, Diana. Thank Hannes and all participants. We really appreciate this contribution. We hope to summarize it and put it on PASSIA website as soon as possible. Thank you all.